The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone, welcome to the CAL webinar Orientation Assessments, New and Revised Resources for the CO Continuum. After just a few framing remarks from me, the majority of the webinar will be conducted by my colleague Julie Sugarman, who has designed the resources that we'll be discussing today. In terms of the format, after the presentation, we plan to leave plenty of time for questions and answers, and we'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible during that time. The webinar is scheduled for 90 minutes. We may not need all of that time, but we will certainly answer all of the questions that we are able to answer today. So before we go into the details of updating you on some of the changes to existing assessment tools that CAL has worked on in recent months and some of the new tools that we have developed, I just want to frame the discussion by locating the assessment tools and the assessment toolkit within the broader set of CO design and delivery building blocks, resources that we have developed over the past several years to enhance the design, delivery, and quality, hopefully, of cultural orientation provided to refugees. For those of you who were in the Training of Trainers webinar, this is some of the information that I shared on that webinar, but we feel that this framing is important in terms of context when we talk about RMP, CO, and overseas CO assessments that we'll be discussing today. So we started several years ago with establishing objectives and indicators for overseas refugee orientation and reception and placement refugee orientation. From there, we moved to developing we moved on to revising the Welcome to the United States set, including the Welcome book and the Welcome video to reflect those objectives and indicators, after which a new curriculum, RMP CO curriculum, Making Your Way, was designed. And throughout all of this, we were thinking about CO assessment, discussing it with the CO work group, and working on assessment tools, largely for RMP CO, but also for overseas orientation. And many of you had a role in that, and we want to thank you for your assistance and for your feedback. And then most recently, in 2014 and early 2015, CAL worked on developing a Training of Trainers guide for refugee orientation, which is a kind of a global USCO resource that did not exist before, and also a video, Training of Trainers video, and all of these resources are available on the web, and I will say a little bit more about that at the end of the webinar. So with that framing in mind, I will turn it over to Julie now to walk us and talk us through some of the new and revised assessment tools.
Okay, hi everyone. The online assessment toolkit is located on the Course Center website at the address on the screen, and you can also access it under the main heading of Providing Orientation and Training. So many of you probably already have that link in your web browser as a favorite. I hope you do. So let's zoom in on this a little bit. The toolkit has gotten so big you can't quite see all of it in one picture. So I'm just going to show you this view when we look at the tools that are available. Before we get into the tools, I want to talk about the assessment pilot that we carried out in 2014. There were two parts of the pilot. First, we received feedback from CO focal points through group meetings and through individual communication with several of the agencies. Some agencies also passed along versions of assessments that their affiliates were using that were modifications of the model CO assessment or were altogether different from the model assessment. This allowed us to look at broader issues of how assessments were being implemented across the country. We discussed some of these issues in the November 2014 assessment webinar. Second, we asked for agencies to volunteer to send a sample of completed assessments for us for analysis. We ended up using 255 individual assessments from 12 affiliates, which represented 7 of the 9 agencies. The 255 individuals whose assessments we looked at had somewhat of an overrepresentation of Iraqis, principal applicants, and refugees with U.S. ties compared to all refugees who arrived in 2014. So that's important to keep in mind as we look at the results. We got scans of the actual assessments with participants' responses, so we entered all of the recorded responses and scores electronically. I then independently scored them to compare the score I would give with the score that the assessor gave. Assessors participating in the pilot also filled out a cover sheet with some information about how the assessment was given, and we got some feedback on the assessment overall and on individual questions from those cover sheets. This graph shows the average score of pilot participants. For example, if you look on the right side of the graph, a little under 40% of participants got a score of 100%. A little over 30% got a score of 95% correct, and so on. So these findings show that the assessment basically works the way that we intended it to, as 58% of participants got 90% or better correct, and 84% of participants got 80% or better of the questions correct. So this shows that the questions really do assess concepts that most refugees know or learn within the RMP period, and that's what we were intending. In addition to looking at the total scores of the participants, I also looked at each question individually in a few different ways. I looked at the percent of participants getting full credit, partial credit, or no credit. And that basically tells you if any of the questions were too easy or too hard, or if participants didn't answer the question the way that was intended. I also looked at whether any types of refugees did better or worse on particular questions than their peers, for example, comparing men and women on a question, to be sure that the questions were fair, and for the most part there weren't any dramatic findings there. Another important piece of the analysis was looking at the quality of scoring by comparing the way I scored to how the original assessors scored. I wanted to know if assessors were following the scoring guidance that we had provided and whether our scoring guidance aligned with the original indicator that the question was based on. So in other words, whether the scoring is fair, consistent, and accurate. Finally, when looking at each question, I also had some comments from assessors from that cover page on whether they had any difficulties with any questions, such as people misinterpreting the meaning of the question or not being able to answer based on their experiences. So we used that as well. Looking at the question-by-question results, each column in this figure represents one question on the assessment. The green segments on the top represent participants who got half a point, the green segments represent participants who got the question totally right, got a point. The yellow segments represent participants who got half a point, and the red segments represent participants who got the question wrong, 0 points. Almost no one got question 1 wrong. Why is it important to learn English? So that was probably too easy, but given our population, it's good to start with an easy one so that participants can get used to the format and so that they can build their confidence. So I'm glad that we started with that one. And whoever, someone in a CO working group meeting had the idea that that might be the easiest one, and it was. You were right, so thank you very much. Going on here, you'll see that there's no result for number 8. That was the question that read, how do you get from your home to the grocery store? When I looked at how participants responded, I saw that most respondents gave just the modality, like I walk there, I take the bus, and so on. And when that happened, participants were usually not prompted to indicate where the grocery store is, which is what we intended. That's what that question was meant to look at. So it wasn't really possible for me to confirm a score at all for most participants because they weren't really wrong and they weren't really right because they didn't have a chance to demonstrate the knowledge that we were looking for. I'll talk about what we did about that and what we did with that question in a few minutes. The other question I want to point out here is number 11, which was, how do you use the local transportation system? Because less than half of the participants got it right. You see that the red bar here goes up into the 40%. An extremely large percentage of those who got the question wrong simply gave the answer that they don't use public transportation. And we know that some of these folks probably could have gotten the question right or gotten at least partial credit if they were prompted to think about whether they knew anything about how to use the public transportation system, not whether they use it, regardless of whether they use it or not. So clearly there was a problem there, and again, I'll talk about what we did about that in a minute. So as a result of the assessment pilot, we learned a lot about things that people were doing that might make their assessment process less valid. And the validity of the assessment is important because you want to be sure that people getting the question right really know the answer, and people getting the answer wrong really don't know the answer. And whether they got it right or wrong isn't just because of how the question was worded or because they don't have a lot of education or whatever the reason might be. These lessons learned were incorporated into the guidance in the online assessment toolkit, and as I mentioned before, we discussed some practices in depth during the November 2014 webinar, which is posted in the online assessment toolkit. So you can get more information about that by reviewing that webinar. Doing the question-by-question analysis that I just talked about allowed us to revise the Model CO assessment, either revising the question itself or the scoring guidance or both. And that's what I'll talk about next. And we also used feedback from the pilot to develop the written version of the Model CO assessment, which we'll talk about later on in the webinar. So now I want to walk you through the changes we made to the Model R&P CO assessment, which will hopefully make it a little easier to administer and make the responses more valid. These changes are incorporated on the assessment that is available in the online orientation assessment toolkit, and we've made the changes on all of the translations, so all of that is available right now. And we'll come back to the screenshot of the orientation assessment toolkit so I can show you that in a few minutes. So what's new? First, we heard from a number of CO focal points and assessors that because the pictures and the drawings used in 2 of the questions created some challenges, that they did create some challenges because some people did not interpret the pictures or the drawings the way that was intended. Some assessors also wrote that they forgot the picture packet and had to skip those 2 questions. So we rewrote those questions so that they're verbal only now, and we did away with the picture packet entirely. I'll show you how we changed those questions specifically in a minute. We also made revisions to a couple of other questions and added or changed scoring guidance. Another change is that the website now includes both Word and PDF versions of the English and translated versions of the assessment so that you can more easily make edits and adaptations using the Word file. And that's for the English and for all of the translations that we have on the website. On the next few slides, I'll show you the revised question and scoring guidance and just point out what changed for each one. For number 1, what is one reason why it is important to learn English? We added a suggested prompt in case the participant states that he or she already speaks English. Actually, a lot of the people that took the assessment in English answered this question anyway, so you may not need to use this prompt very much, but it's there if you need it. Number 2, what is your address and phone number? We added street name as a mandatory element. Now, keep in mind that it's preferable that the participant be able to state or show their entire address, but the elements listed here as the mandatory elements are really the most critical. For example, if they needed to tell a police officer or firefighter where they live. We also added a reminder to assessors that the information must be said, written, or displayed in English, because again, this is about people being able to get along and provide their information when it's necessary to folks in the United States who don't speak their language necessarily. One of the issues we noticed was that we hadn't anticipated was that a number of participants didn't have a phone yet. And assessors dealt with this in a number of ways because we didn't give any guidance on what to do in this case. We added an exemption for participants who don't have a phone number. So because of this, we separated out the half point for the address and the half point for the phone number, because they could have a half point for the first one and an exemption for the second one. So overall for question 2, they can get, for the address, they can get a 0.5 or a 0. And for the phone number, they can get a 0.5 or a 0, or leave the score box blank and check the box for the exemption if they say they don't have a phone. There were no changes to number 3. Can you tell me the 2 services provided by the name of the agency that help refugees resettle or adjust to life in the U.S.? So that's all just the same as it was. Number 4, this one was previously a question with pictures of folks having each of the 6 health problems that are listed here, and participants had to point to a picture representing what they would do about the problem, either care for it yourself, make an appointment with your doctor, or go to the emergency room. As I mentioned earlier, we got some feedback from the agencies and from assessors on these questions in regard to the pictures. For this one, some assessors forgot the picture packet and had to skip the question. And some assessors commented that the pictures were not clear enough in terms of the severity of the problem. And some others said that participants were confused if the way they interpreted the picture was different from the text that appeared beneath each picture. And sometimes dealing with that took some time if what they saw in the picture was different from the text that we had. So we just used that text that appeared below each picture as the basis for a verbal-only question. So these 6 items are still the same 6 items as before. It's just a spoken question now instead of a picture one. Number 5, if you were at the hospital and needed an interpreter, what would you say in English or do to ask for one? For this one, it seemed that some people said, for example, I would ask for an Arabic interpreter in Arabic, and for this one we actually need evidence that the person can get help if they need it. So we added in English to the question to indicate to participants that they're expected to give a verbal response in English. But of course they can also answer the question correctly by showing a language request card. If they respond in English, their English does not need to be grammatically correct, just comprehensible. In the pilot, some participants said that they would call someone they know, a friend or family member, who's bilingual to translate for them. So we added to the guidance that should be marked as correct. Finally, we included a prompt for what to ask if the participant indicated that they would not need an interpreter because they already speak English. They need to demonstrate the skill of being able to ask for the interpreter for someone else in order to get credit for this question. I also just wanted to note that in the assessment pilot, some assessors did not take heed of the fact that there are 2 pieces of the question. First, asking for help or for an interpreter, and second, stating the language they speak. That actually is included in the scoring guidance that was there. It's easy to miss that nuance, though, so agencies should review this item with assessors to be sure that assessors are aware that they need to hear or prompt for both pieces. So for the first part of indicating there's a need, an acceptable response might be need help, or no English, or need interpreter. And for the second part, just the name of the language stated in English would be fine. Some people can get both parts without needing a prompt by saying something like, need Arabic interpreter, please. But other people will just state that they need an interpreter and need the prompt to indicate the language. When scoring this item, it might be helpful to say to yourself, if I was at a hospital and a stranger walked up to me and said whatever the response was to me, would I know what they needed? If you would, they should get a point. There were no changes to number 6. When your name of initial assistance program ends, how will you or your family get money? So again, this one is all the same as it was. Number 7, what are 2 things a refugee can do to become employed? Based on common responses, we decided to accept Learn English as a correct answer rather than one that required prompting, because most assessors marked that response correct, and we realized they were correct in doing so. So that's now changed in the guidance. We also saw a number of people giving the answer that they could gather necessary documentation, like work permits, and we thought that was a good answer also. In terms of answers that are too general and should get a prompt, we added the example of an answer about personal attributes like be hardworking and honest. It's not wrong, it's just not specific enough to be a concrete step that one can take to become more employable. We also added a prompt if the refugee indicates they cannot work due to age or disability, or if they are already employed, because we want to know that they are aware of steps that their family members can take towards becoming employed. Number 8 was that one that was the most problematic. The old wording was, how do you get from your home to the grocery store? And large numbers of participants stated the modality, such as I go by bus, rather than indicating where the grocery store is. So we rewrote the question on the basis of the version that we created for the written version of the assessment. So this question is all new wording. Imagine I am a friend who is staying with you at your home. Tell me how to get from your home to the nearest grocery store. Be sure to give me specific instructions so that I can get there by myself. We also added new guidance that says the answer should provide sufficient evidence that the participant knows where the grocery store or other critical service is. The question is not testing the participant's ability to provide directions. This means that participants should not be penalized for having weak skills in giving directions. For example, if the directions are confusing or poorly worded or they miss a step, as long as they give enough detail to provide evidence to the assessor that they know where the grocery store is, they should get full credit. There were no changes to number 9, what might happen if you do not pay your rent. So this one is the same. Number 10, the original question asked participants to look at 4 drawings, and the assessor said, these pictures show something unsafe. Describe what is unsafe in each picture. We got a lot of feedback that the drawings were causing difficulty. Some refugees had difficulty interpreting the drawing, either specific elements or what the overall drawing signified. So we created a verbal-only version that asked participants, what are 3 things that you should do to be safe in your home? As with some of the other questions, I'm not sure there's really a wrong answer, but it's more likely that people would get partial credit or no credit if they just can't think of 3 things. And finally, number 11 was also quite problematic, as we saw from the graph that less than 50% of the participants got this one right. The old wording was, how do you use name of local transportation system? And a lot of people answered that by basically saying, I don't use it. I think, though, that a lot more people probably could have thought of 2 details if they had sufficient prompting. So we've taken it out of the realm of the personal in terms of telling us about what they do. And we're asking it as though they're teaching someone else about the transportation system. The new question reads, imagine you are helping a newly arrived refugee to learn to use the local transportation system, buses or subway. What are 2 specific things you would tell or show him or her in order to take the bus or subway? We're hoping that this will cut down significantly on the number of people who just pass on answering the question because they don't use it and then don't get any score for that question. So going back to the Orientation Assessment Toolkit, the learner assessments are listed here in the red box. Of course, there's no red box on the actual website, but just to show you. The original model RNPCO assessment link here has a link here where you can find the revised assessment in English and these 13 other languages. And below that is the guidelines for the use of the model RNPCO assessment, which was just slightly revised to align with the changes. So that's the assessment we were just talking about. So below that, actually, there's a new item that just went up in the last hour, and I'll tell you about that in a few minutes. So the website already looks just a tiny bit different from the way it does here. But below these 2 links, which refer to the oral version of the model RNPCO assessment, we have a new written version of the model RNPCO assessment and guidelines for its use. If you click on this link, written version of the model RNPCO assessment, you come to this page, and this looks similar to the page that we had for the oral version. The written version, of course, like the oral, is available in a number of languages that you can see here. And again, the document is available in either Word or PDF. Every version has a cover sheet in English that has reminders for assessors, which is not something that you give to participants. Then the actual assessment is completely in the appropriate language. As you can see on the right, there's 2 pages here of the Arabic version, just to give you an example of what it looks like. Here's a shot of the first page of the English version of the assessment. You can see that there are spaces for the participant's name, their case number, and today's date. There is a little bit of introductory text here that's similar to what an assessor would say at the beginning of the oral version. And then each question has a space, either a box or lines, for the participant to write his or her answer. There are 10 questions in the written version, and it mirrors as closely as possible the questions in the oral version of the model assessment, but they have a more appropriate wording for a written assessment. The one question from the oral assessment that does not have a version in the written assessment is the question, if you were at the hospital and needed an interpreter, what would you say in English or do to ask for one? That would have required people to write in English, and we didn't think that was appropriate. They do have to write their address and phone number, here the second question, in English, but they can actually copy that from something they carry on them, so that makes it a little bit easier language-wise and more equivalent to the question on the oral assessment. We're not going to go through all of those questions because they look pretty similar to the oral version. You can take a look online. I mentioned a moment ago that there's a document with guidelines for the for using the written version of the assessment, but I wanted to make special mention of a couple things that are on that document. The assessment can be administered in a group, but each individual should fill out his or her own paper. As we've talked about on other occasions, we want to be sure that all individuals can demonstrate understanding of these critical issues, so participants should not work in groups to answer the questions. The written model CO assessment may be given to refugees who meet the following criteria: are literate and have good language comprehension skills in the language of the assessment, have at least some formal secondary education in any country, and have demonstrated the ability to fill out forms or complete written work independently, excluding assistance with translation to English. So what we're concerned about in terms of determining who can take the written version is not just language and literacy skills, but the familiarity of the participants with the kind of discourse or communication that happens in an assessment situation. There are skills associated with taking tests that people learn if they have a formal education, so we want to be sure that people who are taking this assessment in the written form have some experience with how to answer assessment questions. On the guidelines, it also indicates how to score each question. It's pretty similar to the oral version of the Model CO assessment in terms of full credit and partial credit. So moving on in the toolkit, another new resource we have is the Overseas CO Multiple Choice Question Bank, which you can find here in the red box. The multiple choice question bank was developed for overseas programs to use in classroom settings, but it certainly could be useful to domestic programs that want to give this type of assessment in a group setting. The questions were developed based on the overseas objectives and indicators and drew heavily on existing overseas assessments that some locations had been piloting in a sample of CO classes. We also conducted a survey of overseas CO trainers of common misconceptions that refugees had either before or after CO, and we used those misconceptions as a basis for the wrong answers. The document is organized into topics such as travel and role of the resettlement agency, so that questions on these topics are listed together. There are a total of 35 questions, but we certainly don't anticipate that anyone will give the assessment as it is with all 35 questions. These questions are a resource for CO providers who want to put together a multiple choice assessment, and you can use them along with other questions that already work for your clients and are aligned with the content of your CO instruction. So you can use them in any combination. And there's some guidance in the accompanying guidance document about how to do that. So here are a couple of examples of questions. The first one is, which statement about life in America is correct? And the choices are, it will be just like the country you came from, nothing will change. B, you will be on your own to learn everything you need to know. C, everything will be easy to get used to. And D, many things will be new and different and it will take time to adjust. In the question bank, the right answers are bolded, as you can see here. So obviously you want to unbold these when you give the assessment. The question bank is available in a Microsoft Word format so that you can easily do that unbolding and cut and paste as you need to. The second example actually has extra wrong answers. We have at least 3 wrong answers on every question in the question bank because 1 right and 3 wrong choices for a total of 4 is usually the right number of choices for most multiple choice assessments. Sometimes, though, we were able to come up with extra wrong answers, so we included all of them for you to choose from. For this one, the question is, the U.S. has laws that regulate which area of daily life? And you might want to include just the wrong answers that you think your population is likely to believe and not include ones that you think that nobody that you work with might believe. So the choices there are A, how you discipline your children, B, what you can talk about at home, C, what you can talk about in public, D, what religion you can practice, E, who is allowed to own property, and F, where you may travel within the U.S. So again, you would get rid of 2 of the wrong answers there and just pick 3. So of course there's a guidance document in the online assessment toolkit that accompanies the multiple choice question bank, and again I just wanted to point out a couple of things that are indicated there. We're not testing a participant's ability to take written tests, so we want to do as much as possible to make the questions easy to answer and to avoid tricks or distractions in the way the questions are organized and worded. Having well-designed questions gives you confidence that people who get them right really know the answer and people who get them wrong really do not. And these were the same ideas that we talked about for the oral version as we've been discussing in past webinars. So the guidance document covers information on the following, including directions for participants on the assessment form, the length of the assessment, customizing the questions in the question bank, the order of questions within the assessment and of answer choices within a question, selecting good and useful questions, different question types like true-false or select all that apply, and appropriate wording of questions and answer choices. Here are a few key suggestions from within that guidance topic, within those the guidance document within those topics I was just discussing. So as I said, you can customize the individual questions for your population and put them together in a way that matches your curriculum. But remember that you can only compare scores using the same assessment. There is a way to statistically determine if 2 tests are equivalent, but it's really complicated, so I don't recommend it. Start your assessment with 1 or 2 really easy questions so that people can get used to the format and gain some confidence. Just as you remember from when you were in school, multiple choice assessments should have the right answer show up first, second, third, or fourth relatively randomly for those of you who just put C to everything and assumed you would get at least a quarter of them right. Limit the use of true, false, or yes, no questions. There are some good reasons to use those, but remember that they're not very robust because people have a 50-50 chance of getting them right, and also it can be really hard to create plausible incorrect answers. Another thing is to avoid using tricky answer choices like all of the above or none of the above, or negatively phrased items like which of the following is not such and such, or questions where people select all that apply instead of just selecting the one right choice. Those kinds of elements add in elements of difficulty that relate to how test savvy a person is, and we want to keep it simple. The correct answer should not stand out because of how it is worded. For example, if it's longer or more specific than the other 3 choices. And finally, answer choices should be plausible. For example, if you're asking who will find you a job, Santa Claus is not plausible. So the reason that you don't want to use those sort of joke choices or implausible choices is that if you have 4 answer choices and 2 of them are clearly implausible, people are really just choosing between 2. And instead of only having a 25% chance of guessing correctly, they now have a 50% chance of guessing correctly, and it's not as good a question. So what all this boils down to is that writing good multiple choice questions is really hard because there are a lot of ways you can give away the right answer by how you write the question and the answer choices. We tried to follow all of these rules or suggestions when writing the multiple choice question bank, and I think we did pretty well, but there are a few questions that aren't quite ideal because we were trying to balance these guidelines with what we know about our purpose and our population for this assessment. So the last set of new resources are here at the bottom in this red box, the CEO Assessment Plan Template and CEO Assessment Plan Review Checklist. Throughout the process of developing and sharing assessment tools with you, one thing we've discussed is that there are a lot of decisions that individual agencies will need to make about how their assessments will be implemented. And it's really important to have a plan and policies around these decisions. The assessment plan template will help agencies write their plans, and the checklist will help local and national agencies ensure that everything is covered in the plan and that it makes sense. Here's a screenshot of the first page of the template. This document is available in Microsoft Word, so you can type right into it. If you want to fill it out by hand, there's not a lot of room here where there's just one space in between each of the questions as it is right now, so you'll want to add some additional spaces in between the questions so you have enough room to write in your answers. An important thing to note about the template is that not all of the items are appropriate in all circumstances, so you can revise or add to the questions or take some out as much as you would like, or as much as is appropriate for your agency. Here's a shot of part of the first page of the checklist. The checklist can be used to evaluate a plan using the template I just showed you, or it can be used to evaluate any assessment plan that you've already put together. Also, it can be used for self-evaluation by the people who designed the assessment or by national agencies to review the local resettlement agency's plans. If you're planning to submit a plan to be reviewed by your national agency, you should also include a copy of your assessment or assessments and any additional guidance or forms that are used. The checklist has columns for you to indicate if the component is okay, which is here on the left, is not okay, or is not applicable. But of course you can modify this checklist to include other information like a notes field or anything else that would be helpful for you. Another thing that you'll notice about the checklist is that there's a number of places where it says that some policies or plans are reasonable and appropriate. You may develop your own definition of what ought to be in place, or you may just review each plan and decide whether it seems reasonable and appropriate. In some cases, Cal has made suggestions about what we think is reasonable and appropriate on documents in the toolkit, the question and answer document, the frequently asked questions, the various guidance documents. But in other cases, there are a number of reasonable ways you can implement your assessment, so it just has to make sense for your circumstances. In other words, we left that vague on purpose. The assessment plan template and checklist provide spaces to plan the following topics: logistics, who, when, where, how to give the assessment, how to follow up with participants based on their performance, the feedback loop on assessment procedures, such as how will you ensure quality control on administration and scoring, and what training will be available to assessors, what are the planned uses of data and how do your procedures align with them, how are new and modified questions reviewed, how are scoring guidelines reviewed, and procedures for data entry, analysis, and sharing. There are some other resources that we haven't talked about that are still in the online assessment toolkit. The overseas and domestic objectives and indicators that Sonia mentioned earlier. Questions and answers about the model CO assessment. This is actually just slightly revised based on the development of the written version of the assessment. Frequently asked questions about assessment and evaluation, which covers an assessment and evaluation more broadly than just one type of learner assessment. And the 2 webinars on assessment from last year. We have one more tool, and it was still to come until about an hour and a half ago when it actually went up, which we just finished, and I just want to show you a preview of this. This is a web-based interactive activity that walks an assessor through some decisions that they will need to make in terms of prompting and scoring the oral model CO assessment. This screenshot shows our intrepid test taker, Mrs. Rahimi. In the activity, you ask her the assessment questions on the Model CO assessment, and depending on what she says, you have some choices of how you will respond, which are here on the bottom of the page. There's a 1 and a 2 and a 3, and so you pick which one of these answers you want to say that you are going to give. An important thing to know about these choices is there is often not one clear right thing to do and two clear wrong things to do. So it's not like a multiple choice like we were just discussing. Sometimes 2 or 3 of the choices all are some degree of correct things to do. Because sometimes our participants say things that require us to use our judgment to score or to follow up on. So when you pick a response, the next screen gives you some feedback on the choice you made. So it lets you know whether it was a good response to make or maybe something else that you could do instead. So again, we just posted the link to this resource in the Online Assessment Toolkit. It is located just under the other, the Model CO assessment and the guidance document for the CO assessment. We've discovered that it doesn't seem to be working with Internet Explorer, but it is working with Firefox right now. So we're going to look into that issue with Internet Explorer. But if you want to go ahead and look at it today, probably using Firefox would be better. So, and actually since we came back here, that new resource is located now right here in between the guidelines for use of the model RNPCO assessment and the written version, because it applies just to the oral version, and that's what these 2 bullet points are for. So that covers all of the elements, new, revised, old elements in the Online Assessment Toolkit. We certainly hope these are helpful for you and help you organize having an assessment plan and having continuity and consistency in the way that you do CO assessment. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Sonia for a moment, and then we'll take some questions.
Thank you so much, Julie. Before we go to the question and answer part of the webinar, I just wanted to mention a few other new resources and recent resources on the Course Center website in case you don't go on it every day and check the resources. So a couple of things I wanted to highlight. First, the one you see in the middle of the screen with the title Choosing My Way. That is the refugee orientation video game that Cal developed and we posted earlier this year, and we hope that you will go to the website and check that out. It can also be downloaded onto phones. And then if you look to the left of that, there is a screenshot of refugee training and orientation, a guide for service providers, which is the training of trainers, CO training of trainers guide. And there is also an accompanying training of trainers video, which gives kind of an overview of the CO Continuum from overseas CO, from some examples of overseas CO through different settings, CO settings around the country in the U.S. and illustrate some of the methods and approaches that the guide talks about. As many of you and most of you probably have heard, Cal will be turning over the Cultural Orientation Technical Assistance project to IRC as of March 1st. In the case of the website, many people are asking what will happen to the resources. The current Course Center website will stay up until March 15th. And in the meantime, you will be receiving information and a link to the IRC website, which will replace the Course Center website. And many of these resources, all of the resources, in fact, that PRM funded Cal to develop over the years will be available on the IRC website. And we will also, for a time, continue to keep the Course Center website up, and that one has all of the PRM-funded resources as well as additional resources that we have developed over the years. So I just want to assure everybody that the resources will continue to be available for your use, downloading, copying as they have been in the past. And before I turn it over to Julie with to answer your questions, I just want to say that we have, as we transition away from the CO Technical Assistance Project, that we have enjoyed working with all of you over the years, have appreciated your help and input, and wish you all the best as you continue with the very important work that you do. Julie?
Okay, so we have some questions already. Feel free to, if you have not put your question in yet, please feel free to type that in. We'll just start answering the ones that we have. One question is, what were common problems encountered by assessors? For the most part, people did pretty well. There weren't that many overall problems. It was more question by question. Things with the pictures, that was what we heard a lot of. And I'm just looking through my notes to find my other difficulties that we had. I think, and another one that people commented a lot was number 11 was the name of the local transportation system, or how do you use the local transportation system, and people said that that was just vague and they didn't really know how to score it. But in terms of the actual administration of the assessment, you know, people, clients not wanting to participate or overall problems, we really didn't have too much like that. There was just a couple people who noted that they didn't give the assessment because for one reason or another, so there didn't really seem to be too many overall programs. The next question, what was the average amount of time needed to complete the assessment? It was, again, I'm looking at my, it was either 20 or 21 minutes, I can't remember, but that should, that should do. Let me just look really quickly. Yeah, it's about 20 minutes. So only, very few people took more than, you know, 30 or 40 minutes. Most people were right in that 20-minute range. The third one, with all due respect, all clients should at least be reachable by a phone number and familiarized with that, right? If they don't have a phone number, then they aren't being given an opportunity to live independently, and all their schedules are screened by someone else, perhaps. I think that's a good point. What we discovered was that some of these assessments were being given really early, like within the first 30 days, and maybe people wouldn't have a phone number quite yet. So again, that was something that we didn't realize would happen until we started getting some of these pilot assessments back. That's a great topic for you all to talk about. You know, what do you do about that when a person doesn't have a phone number, and how can that be resolved? You know, what do you do? How do you follow up when that's the answer to the assessment question? I think that's an interesting issue. The next one says, for question 4, item number 4, I've heard that the Somali translation actually says you put your finger. We will definitely check up on that, and I assume that you're referring to the new translated version. Or actually, it's that one might have come over, so we'll double check that one for sure. So thank you so much for letting us know about that. Next one, for question 7, what would you do if the client answers ask friends? This is the question about employment, I believe. Let me just come back to that here to make sure I answer the right thing. Yes, what are 2 things a refugee can do to become employed? We actually did have a number of people say, I'd ask my friends if they know of any jobs, and I think that's a perfectly good answer. I would give credit for that. I assume what they're not saying, I would ask my friends what they should do. You know, they need to know that. But I think what our questioner here meant is that they would ask their friends if their friends know of any jobs, and that's sure something that we recommend to all people to do when they're looking for a job. So I think that's a really good answer. So good question. The next one, why not make the translated written version multiple choice to make it possible for non-multilingual staff to complete the assessment? Well, the written version is actually translated. So the written version can be given out by anybody. It doesn't need to be someone who speaks the same language as the assessee. There was also a question later on that I wanted that is similar, so let me address that now. Why is multiple choice only available for overseas CO? And of course, it's not only. It's on the toolkit. It's something that anyone can use. I do want to just reiterate that multiple choice questions are certainly the fastest to implement and they're the fastest to score, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're giving you the best information. The overseas RSCs have entire classes they do, and because of various other logistical reasons, having a multiple choice assessment, which is also targeted to a particular group and who've had a particular curriculum, seem to make sense. If doing multiple choice makes sense for you, then absolutely take a look at it and see if you think it would work. But I would caution that just because multiple choice is easiest on us doesn't mean that we're getting the best information out of it. And someone followed up to the question from before, and now I see what they were asking. The original question, which was the translated written version, still requires people to write out answers in another language. And so the follow-up question is, yes, but how do you know if they've given a right answer? Thank you for that, because now I know what you were asking. So the written version of the written version of the Model CO assessment is translated, and so you can hand that paper over to somebody and they write their answers longhand in their language. But that is really comparable to what we do with the oral version. You can't, again, you're not going to want to just make just as I said, don't take that oral version and hand it to someone and have them write on it. I'm now saying don't take that written version and just plop 3 choices on there and hand it to them, because it's not meant for that. If you do want to give a multiple choice assessment and it's a reasonable thing to do for your population and it makes sense based on other factors, check out the multiple choice question bank. But again, with the kind of information we're looking for, with the kind of population we're looking for who may not be the most test savvy, and again, really depends on your population, who you have. We want to try to give them every chance to get the question right. And with a multiple choice question, it's just circling something. You have no way of knowing whether they just guessed, whether they really don't know, whether they liked that answer choice because it sounded more realistic, but it's not the right. I mean, there's a million things about a multiple choice test that mean that it doesn't give you as much rich information as an open-ended question does. But I absolutely appreciate that does take time to give the assessment, to score it, to translate it, all of those things. Let's see where I was. The next one is the oral model assessment a finalized tool? Can we start to use this model assessment? Absolutely. I think again, what's online now is the updated things. And you absolutely can start using it. How you're going to use various of these tools is really up to your agencies. So if you're wondering that and you're a local agency or local affiliate, you probably want to talk to the national headquarters and see what they think about it. But I think things change, people change. I don't think it would be appropriate to keep that one tool forever. I think it should be revisited at some point to make sure that it's still appropriate. Next question, how about an electronic version, like an online survey, so that an assessor could record answers directly in a program that would be able to aggregate the data? That would be great. And so if someone wants to take on doing that, I think that would be terrific. That would make things much easier, an app or a survey or something like that. You just want to make sure that it maintains all the functionality that the paper version have. Let's see. Okay. Do you have any suggestions for comparing scores when you allow for exemptions? I think probably the only thing to do is like what I did in that slide that had the percents. it's a little tricky because with only, if you have 11 questions or then you go down to 10 questions, each one is worth 10%, so getting 3 wrong is like 70%, which sounds really low. But I think really just, dividing 7 by 11 or 7 by 10 or 7 by 9 or whatever, the correct divided by the total total taken, I think is really your best option for comparing scores when you allow for exemptions. Someone wrote in to let us know that Choosing My Way, downloading Choosing My Way to computer seems to be down at present, and we will definitely take a look at that. So thank you very much for letting us know about that. The next question, have additional dollars for local agencies to appropriate implement CO been proposed? That's a question that we can't answer, and unfortunately we don't have anyone from PRM here. We are going to share all of these questions with them, and certainly they will, you can ask them and they can respond, but that's not something that we're able to answer today, unfortunately. Next question, for number 5, which is the one about if you're at the hospital and need a translator, most of my client answer, and this is the quote, no English, speak Somali. Is that considered correct even though not a full sentence but understandable? I think that's perfect. I would, if someone came up to me in a hospital and I was trying to communicate with them and they said that, I would know exactly what to do. So I think that's a totally great answer, full credit, one point answer. The next one is, I'm interested in how the grading of the written assessment will look. Yeah, because there's nothing on the page like there is for the oral, so you do have to kind of maybe go back and forth. Maybe some kind of an answer sheet could be created, or I'm not sure. I think you're just going to have to, on the written assessment guidance there, it does say, how to give, it's basically, if there's one answer required, it's either right or wrong. If we ask for 2 things, you get half a point for each. The one where there's like multiple ones, like 4 or 5, it's really similar to the oral, where it's like if you get all of them correct, you get 1. If you get between 3 and 5 correct, you get half point or whatever it is. So it's really very similar to the oral assessment. Let's see, suggestion, this is the next one. Please label translated test in English to indicate language. Farsi and Arabic looks the same. If you give both to an English-speaking assessor, they would not be able to identify one from the other. And that's a good point. I think it says it on the cover sheet, but maybe not on the actual page. So yeah, that's something that we can take care of. So thank you very much. I think that's a great suggestion, and we can take care of that. Okay, I feel the question number 10, these pictures show something unsafe and show the picture. On the old version is more helpful than the new version. What are 3 things you should do to be safe? The reason I said that, because I show the picture and I ask, is it safe or unsafe, rather than the client thinking, and it's hard to answer. So, give it a try. I think one of the other things I suspected with those picture ones, and I didn't have any data for this because people didn't write down exactly what people said, but I suspect especially for that one, for the safe and unsafe pictures, is that people would describe something in the picture and get credit for it, even if they weren't exactly saying what's wrong about it. So they might say, like, there's paper towels, and maybe they wouldn't go on to say the paper towels are too close to the stove, which is the answer we were looking for. I don't know whether that's true. I suspect that, but enough people told us that the pictures were difficult. But try it. Try the new one. Try the old one. See the kinds of questions you get. You want to really make sure, again, that the question you're asking is really getting at, do people really know this content? So, again, we definitely would want to try out the new questions and take another look at it through another sort of mini pilot if we were going to continue with that. Another one says, it just seems like the written version would be much, sorry, it skipped. The written version will be much harder to implement. I'd be surprised if many agencies found it useful unless they were highly specialized. We did have a few who said that they were just giving the oral version in the form that it existed. They were handing that to clients. So the written version is just sort of for those people who really wanted to do that. This next question, if the client answers in their own language, how can we score the assessment? That was what we discussed before. It will obviously need to be translated by someone who speaks the language. Just as you would for the oral assessment, you'd have to have an assessor there. Let's see. To the person who talked about an electronic online version, try putting the questions into a Google form. Yeah, that's a great idea. Oops, that was a repeat. We got that one. Will the CO assessment, will the written version be in Russian or Ukrainian? Yeah, I don't think we have that. Do you want to assess? Okay, I'm going to pass to Sonia for a second.
So as I mentioned, the new COTA provider, IRC, will continue with some of these activities. So for things such as requests for additional translations, please channel that through your headquarters, and they can channel it to PRM, IRC after March 1st, and hopefully those translations will continue into languages that you find useful.
All right. Okay, next one. How do you suggest we discourage assessors and assessees on focusing too much on numbers and scores and looking for specific answers rather than focusing on meeting refugees where they're at and listening to what answers they are giving? Are you concerned that by providing examples of correct answers, assessors may only consider these answers are correct when in actuality there are many different correct answers? For example, the example just provided saying no English, speak Somali. I think that's a fantastic point. Yeah, that's always a concern when you have an assessment like this where it's open-ended, and again, this is not the preferred format from a testing point of view, because it really does require assessors to use their judgment, and it's not as standardized as a multiple choice assessment. But knowing that it would be very difficult to perfectly write questions so that people with all different kinds of backgrounds and educational abilities and personal experiences, that they all would be able to correctly interpret the question, that was just really so challenging. So this idea of having a really open-ended question and probing to make sure that they are, you know, exactly what you said, meeting them where they're at, and seeing if they really know the information or not, it's a real skill, and I think it's something that assessors are going to need training on and need to talk about. I'm sure many of the people giving this haven't given an assessment like this before. So I think that's really, you know, up to agencies to help them understand the purpose of the assessment, look at some of the documentation, and do some practice, and really just sort of keep reinforcing that this is not gotcha style testing. This is really trying to make sure that people understand the material, and I think that has an effect on thinking about the provision of CO as well. And, you know, how are we, as we're talking to people and teaching this information, how are we constantly doing formative assessment so that we can make sure that people really understand, and what kinds of questions are good questions to ask in our during CO while we're actually giving the instruction. Hopefully doing this practice and seeing this assessment and how it works can actually help people with their formative questioning that they use during CO as well. So that's probably not as specific an answer as you would like, but you make just a really terrific point. And hopefully as we go on, if people find strategies that they've used that have worked, I'm sure everybody would really love to hear those. Someone adds that the written test could be useful for the more quickly adapting the English fluent clients, such as many SIV clients. I think that's definitely true. There's lots of folks who can, who will really be able to answer these the questions and not be thrown off by the fact that it's a written assessment. So that's a good point. Let's see. When will we conduct the follow-up after the assessment? And what about if the client answers 10.5 of 11? Is required follow-up? Is the follow-up required? Again, that's a great question. That's something that that you should discuss in your agency, either in your local or your national agency, and you should have those two are specific. You read my mind or read the mind of the template. Those two things are specific issues that should be policies in place. So I don't have any particular suggestions for that. It's up to each agency to decide either the national or the local affiliate, depending on how your group works. It's up to you to decide exactly how you're going to do follow-up and exactly what the scores mean. I think, I still don't, we're still not in a position to give a cutoff to say 10 is okay or 9 is okay or 8 is okay. I don't know that. I mean, it's conceivable in the future with enough data that we might be able to come up with something like that. We're not in that position now. But I think that, again, this is an opening for dialogue, and it's something for you to use as helping to inform yourselves in your agencies about how your clients are doing. So hopefully, we'll be able to come up with something a little bit, in your agency you'll come up with something a little bit more specific, but at this point we don't really have a good cutoff point. All right, let's see. I don't know that there's any more. I think that's all we have. Any other questions? I think we got everything from above. All right. Well, I will thank you very much for, oops, one more. One more question. Do you recommend to conduct the assessment after they're in the U.S. for 2 months or less? Another great question, and that's another thing that will come up in your assessment plan that you'll put together. That's another question for the agency to decide. PRM has requested that these be completed within the R&P period, but I do suggest from an assessment point of view that you pick something similar, like after 2 months or 3 days after within 3 days after the end of CO, or if you have something comparable, then you can compare the scores. But the PRM requirement is to complete it within the R&P period. So, all right. Let me turn it back over to Sonia one more time, and if there's no more questions, then I will also say thank you.
Thank you so much, Julie, and thank you so much again to all of the webinar participants for all of your questions and input. Both the PowerPoint and the recording of the webinar will be posted on our website in the coming days, and we will also transfer those documents over to IRC, and they will be available on their CO Technical Assistance website once that is up and running in mid-March. Thank you very much, everyone, and thanks again, Julie, for your presentation.